now.
You're watching ABC News Live special coverage of the Supreme Court arguments over a potential ban on TikTok in the U.S. The key question, does a law banning apps owned by foreign adversaries violate the First Amendment? The law passed in May says TikTok's Chinese parent company, ByteDance, must sell the app to an American company or face a ban in the U.S. in just a few days. So far, the justices have been grappling with questions about free speech, national security, and what the law truly regulates. TikTok's lawyers argue that the law targets the app's algorithm, which they say is core to how the platform expresses itself and connects users, and that regulation doesn't just hurt ByteDance as a foreign owner, but directly affects TikTok as a U.S.-based company. The attorney for a group of content creators on TikTok also argued American creators have a right to work with the publisher of their choice. Now the attorney for the U.S. government is making her case for upholding the law. And we have team coverage on this. Senior national correspondent and ABC News Live anchor Terry Moran, senior White House correspondent Selena Wang, ABC Supreme Court contributor Kate Shaw, legal contributor Kim Whaley, and contributor and Google Tech Policy Fellow Mike Muse are all here to help us unpack this. Terry, let's start off with the big picture here. What stands out to you so far from the arguments, and do you feel like you're getting a sense of how the justices might be leaning?
Well, the first question is easy to answer. What stands out to me are the stakes here. This is an argument that is clearly grappling with some fundamental 21st century issues, and you can hear that in the arguments, in the justices' questions, in the intensity of the rhetorical combat here. On the one hand, the national security interest of the United States against what is an adversary nation, formally described now, the People's Republic of China. On the other hand, 170 million Americans speaking all kinds of things, from recipes to movie reviews to political speech, all kinds of things on this platform, which is owned by an American company to begin with, TikTok USA, but that company owned by ByteDance, based in the Bahamas, controlled by China. And that intersection is being discussed at a very high level. My own feeling on the second question, who's winning? I'd be worried if I were TikTok, because it does sound, certainly, Chief Justice John Roberts has been very strong on deferring to Congress, which passed this law, and the president, who signed it, on national security interests. And it is also pretty clear to me that even liberal justices like Elena Kagan and Ketanji Brown Jackson have been exploring how far the Supreme Court wants to go in refereeing the national security of the United States as defined by Congress and the president. So I'd be nervous if I were TikTok, but those free speech arguments there are very strong as well.
Kate, Noel Francisco, TikTok's lawyer, brought up this hypothetical, saying that if China leveraged Washington Post owner Jeff Bezos, who of course also owns Amazon, if China tried to kind of pressure him and leverage him into publishing on the New York Post content that they wanted, that the U.S. government, even in a case like that, could not force him to sell or shut down the paper. What did you make of that comparison?
Interesting comparison, and I think that TikTok is maybe not going to succeed in making that succeed in convincing the justices that that's something, a comparison that is an apt one, because the federal government, as it's arguing right now, we should say that these arguments are still ongoing, is suggesting that it is not just about, potentially manipulating content as the hypo contemplated, but about a foreign adversary actually using the information that users provide to the platform in order to engage in kind of covert operations, potentially recruitment and espionage, and all of that is absent from the Washington Post hypo that was being discussed earlier today. But I do think that there are these difficult lines to draw. The justices, I think, do seem sympathetic to this law for the most part, and so I agree that TikTok should be nervous at this point in the argument. Even this very capable lawyer, Noel Francisco, who was the former Trump Solicitor General and is very well known to the justices, had very rough going in front of the justices in his defense of TikTok. So too did the second lawyer who we've heard from this morning, Jeff Fisher, who represents not TikTok, the entity, but a bunch of users and creators who are challenging this law, which they say will make it very difficult for them to successfully, grow their businesses and communicate with users and buyers in the way they have come to do via TikTok. There's a real question about whether, if this law goes through, they could pivot to using other platforms. They say they haven't had the success on other places that they have had on TikTok, and so their First Amendment rights are being undermined by this law. I think this is actually so far a hard argument to call. I will say there is one possibility, which is there could be some type of kind of compromise or delay. Right now, this law goes into effect on January 19th, and Noel Francisco said unless the justices do something, TikTok will go dark on that date, although there is some question. New users wouldn't be able to download it, but maybe current users would be able to continue using it, at least for some short period. But could the justices essentially pause the effective date of this law, wait for the change in administrations and some kind of potential political compromise, as Donald Trump asked the justices to do in a filing he made last week? So I think that is one potential middle ground that we could see coming out of this case.
And Kate, I want to point out, I misspoke, I think, when I posed the question to you and said New York Post. It is correctly, as you stated, the Washington Post that Jeff Bezos owns. Mike, there was an interesting part of the questioning with Justice Barrett when she was asking whether it's TikTok's algorithm that is the speech here that needs to be protected. The attorney answered in part yes, sort of a yes and there. Why is that so critical to this argument?
I think it's really critical, and I think really her and Gorsuch, what my takeaway is, I actually have a different tack from my fellow colleagues that were just speaking right now. I don't necessarily think that TikTok is necessarily on the ropes. I think TikTok gave a great presentation with Francisco, who was representing the company itself, and I think Fisher did an actually really good job of really humanizing it, in particular as we went and got to the U.S. Solicitor General when she began to be questioned, particularly from Thomas. Justice Thomas actually surprised me with this question about this idea of covert. What is covert? Is it any difference of covert manipulation between a U.S.-owned company and a non-U.S. company? Because what he is saying is that, if you think about in the larger context, there are ways that we have domestic terrorists here, and there are people who are living here in America who may not have America's best interests, who may want to manipulate the propaganda for their own best use. Once that question got into it, I began to illuminate and was like, this is actually the core. Is that this isn't just what China could do as much so as what other social media companies can do, which I've always been talking about, to which comes in Gorsuch. Gorsuch has a really technical understanding of how the TikTok and algorithm work to get to your question about Barry. Don't worry, Diane, I was going to get there. They have a fundamental they have a fundamental understanding of how the algorithm works. What Gorsuch was getting to was allow Francesco to identify what is the source code. What he is saying is that the TikTok-based U.S. company, the TikTok that's based here in the United States, uses a source code from ByteDance. But that source code is the IP that the U.S.-based company actually needs to do the algorithm that outputs the posts that we see from the users. What they're saying is that ByteDance in China doesn't have, they may own the IP of that, but that doesn't control the manipulation. And what Francisco did was walk us through a flow chart, if you will, in terms of how that goes. The TikTok, the U.S.-based TikTok pulls the data from the source code, then it goes through a content moderation filter based upon the rules that are set from the U.S. But then from there, then it filters out the content that the user sees, which goes to a larger question of the free speech of your question of what Barrett is saying, is that it's the free speech that is at odds. And just because it may not be the content you enjoy, it doesn't give the government the right to censor it because you don't enjoy it.
And I want to get to Kim, but quickly, I also want to pull on one other point that
Sure.
I heard him making, which is that because of exactly what you just explained, that ByteDance owns the source code, the IP behind the algorithm, you can't just say, okay, we'll separate the U.S. portion of TikTok and call it a day, because he's saying we have to use that source code for the algorithm, and so it ends up being a completely different entity. Did I understand that right?
You nailed it, Diane, and which really another person who surprised me was Justice Alito. I know you and I laughed about, I didn't expect Justice Alito to use a fashion statement talking about his old shirt, but that gets to the uniqueness of what Fisher, who is representing the content users, is saying. Fisher is saying that what makes TikTok so unique is that it has a very special editorial pedigree that American users who are not celebrities, who are just ordinary Americans, who has a small mom-and-pop coffee shop, who's able to use this to attract incredible business to their companies. This is why they specifically love it. What Alito said,
because of the algorithm,
because the algorithm,
which
can't be replaced. What Alito said was, are you telling me that I love this old shirt? Because I love this old shirt, there's no other store in the mall that can replace this old shirt? Fisher responds, that's exactly what I'm saying, because you can have somewhere in the New York Times a floor of 100 editors. He said that's what makes the New York Times so special, is that 100 editors on that floor. You can't replicate that with a new set of editors, because it becomes a different company, a different function, and a different use of the users. To what Fisher's is saying is what prohibits those American content creators' free speech.
Kim, the other aspect here is the foreign adversary, foreign government, and who really controls TikTok here. Francisco says, if TikTok were totally controlled by a foreign government, that this case would be very different, because in that case, there's a good reason for saying this foreign adversary does not have free speech rights here in the United States. TikTok, however, based in the U.S. So where is the line when it comes to influence versus total control, and separating TikTok USA, TikTok Inc., and ByteDance?
Yeah, so I think the 1,000-point view of this from 1,000 feet above is, what is the bigger danger here? I think that question gets to, can China just do its mischief through a U.S. corporation and hide behind the First Amendment because U.S. corporations have First Amendment rights? So there was some pushback from TikTok on whether China has First Amendment rights, but I think the justices would say, no, a foreign adversary doesn't have protections under the First Amendment in the United States. But can they just have like an intermediary and say, oh, we can do whatever we want now, so long as we feed it through a U.S. corporation? On the other hand, I think the justices are saying, yeah, but if we allow that, then can the government, the U.S. government, then come in and start regulating all kinds of online content and speech just because there's some foreign entity involved? It's really, which is the bigger boogeyman, China or the U.S. government? And is there a way that this law tailors it to only really apply to these the adverse foreign interests like China? And I want to offer one other frame, Diane, which is, this is a First Amendment case. We have this act of Congress, so the voters in theory support this through their legislators. You can just vote them out of office if you don't like it. So who actually has the First Amendment rights? China, no. TikTok, yes. And then the third piece was U.S. people who use TikTok. But then the question is, do we all really have a right to be able to speak through our favorite app? The app that lets us speak the way we want to speak, is that really shutting down speech to have us go to a different app? And I think the bigger question across all of it is, this really the right mechanism to resolve all this? Is the First Amendment really designed in this moment to make these nuances when it dates back to, 1791?
And Selena, walk us through the national security concerns at the heart of all of this.
Yeah, look, there's deep concerns about a U.S. adversary owning such a critical media platform in the United States. But as we've been talking about, this isn't just about content on the platform. It's also about data collection. So the U.S. government is arguing that because Chinese ByteDance owns TikTok, that the Chinese government could compel TikTok to turn over sensitive data on American users, and that it could also use TikTok to spread misinformation. Now, the lawyer arguing on behalf of the U.S. government, we heard her say earlier that the Chinese government could weaponize, quote, weaponize TikTok at any time to harm the United States. Now, TikTok vociferously denies those claims, saying that it does not share user data with the Chinese government and that its American operations are separate. But there was a really interesting exchange with Justice Kavanaugh with the lawyer representing TikTok, and I just want to read to you part of what he said. He asked the lawyer representing TikTok whether it's a reasonable risk to consider that the Chinese government could use information on tens of millions of American TikTok users who are currently in their teens and 20s to eventually, quote, develop spies, turn people, blackmail people a generation from now when they're working for the FBI or CIA. Now, TikTok's lawyer did not dispute those risks. He said he acknowledged those risks, but what he takes issue with, which is the means that they are going to deal with that risk, which they argue is effectively shutting down the platform. platform. Now, another important point I want to bring up, Diane, is that if TikTok is banned, if this eventually goes through, China would essentially be getting a taste of its own medicine. Virtually all major U.S. social media apps are banned in China, and the version of TikTok that operates in China, called Douyin, also owned by ByteDance, it is, of course, subject to China's censorship laws.
All right, Selena Wang, Kim Whaley, Terry Moran, Kate Shaw, and Mike Muse, thank you all.